Welcome back to our biology series. This is lesson 3, water and carbon. So we're continuing our introduction to chemistry. Last time we talked about matter, atoms, elements, etc. Now we're talking about two important, I would say, molecules. Water is actually a molecule, carbon is an atom. So two important substances of life, water and carbon. Water first. Water, also known as H2O, as written here, it's polar covalent, and neighboring H2O can form hydrogen bonds. So you may not know anything of what we're talking about if you didn't watch the last lesson, but if you did, you should know. It's basically saying that this is what H2O looks like. Oops. This is just a rough drawing. You know what? Let me actually make it better, because I'll be using this a lot during our slides. So this is the oxygen molecule. This is the hydrogen, and this is the other hydrogen. So H2O is polar covalent. First of all, covalent, it means that the bonds between the hydrogen and the oxygen, they share electrons, they don't give or take electrons. Polar is a very fancy term for saying that they don't share the same electronegativity. This is more electronegative than this. Basically, this shares more electrons than this. Or sorry, this takes more electrons than this. When we say neighboring H2O can form hydrogen bonds, we talked about hydrogen bonds last time, but a hydrogen bond is basically between a hydrogen molecule and either an oxygen, nitrogen, or a fluorine molecule. So here, and it's between molecules, it's not within the molecule itself, which is why this H and this O don't have a hydrogen bond. So between this O and this H is a hydrogen bond. These give it many, many, many important qualities. Like I said, many important properties. Cohesion is the attraction between two H2O molecules, and it basically forms those little beads of water you see on the grass every morning. Adhesion is the attraction between H2O and another molecule, and it basically forms a bunch of important things. It's really useful. An example would be, have you ever seen a graduated cylinder? Well, oh. This is a rough drawing of a beaker or a graduated cylinder, basically anything that holds a substance. And when you put water in it, it sort of bends downward like this. It's not straight flat, it sort of bends downward, and that's caused by adhesion. Surface tension is a difficulty to break or stretch the surface of a liquid. Water has a high surface tension. Specific heat is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 gram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. Basically, how much heat it takes to raise the temperature of a substance. Again, water has a high heat specific heat. This causes resistance to change temperature, which is why if you live near a body of water, especially an ocean, then the temperatures near you aren't as extreme as they would be, let's say, in the middle of the United States. Los Angeles has better average temperatures than Kansas. Heat of vaporization, amount of energy needed to convert 1 gram of liquid to gas. This has to do with specific heat. It's basically not just raising it by 1 degree Celsius, but raising it by the amount of temperature needed to reach its boiling point. Again, water has a high heat of vaporization, and this is around 580 calories. Wow, that's a lot. Evaporative cooling is the temperature of surface of the remaining water would decline after vaporization. So that's a lot of fancy words. Basically, if you have some water and some become vapor, the surface of the remaining liquid would decline. The temperature would decline. Basically, it'll start cooling. That's why it's called evaporative cooling. Also, water is less dense as solid than liquid. Basically, ice, the solid form of water, is less dense than liquid. This causes ice to float, and it's important, especially in the winter, because when a pond freezes, if ice were more dense than liquid, it would sink. So when a pond freezes, it'll freeze from the bottom up, which would kill all the life in it. But since water is less dense, it floats. So the ice just freezes the surface of the pond, and therefore the life under it can keep on living, even in the coldest of times. Water is also the solvent of life. Little bit of background: a solution is a homogeneous mixture of two or more substances. So, for example, if there's a glass of water and you put in some salt in it, this is a solution, because when you put in salt and stir it a bit, it becomes one substance. It's not like the salt is not dissolved. This is called a dissolved substance or a solution. But if you put a rock in it, it won't be a solution, because obviously it's not dissolved. Getting rid of all the salt here. The solute is the thing being dissolved. So for example, salt, the solvent dissolves the solute. So water is the solvent, salt is the solute. An aqueous solution is basically when water is the solvent. So the example above was an aqueous solution because water was the solvent, salt was the solute. Water is not the universal solvent, it's the solvent of life. It's not the universal one because it doesn't dissolve everything. It only dissolves certain molecules, but it dissolves a lot. And this includes polar molecules and ions. Polar molecules because like dissolves like, and ions because, as said here, the hydration shell is a sphere of H2O that dissolves an ion. So basically, when an ion is, or an ionic compound is dissolved in water, the water forms a hydration shell around the ion, and it basically breaks it down, dissolving it. So yes, like I said, it also dissolves polar molecules like dissolves like, which means that it doesn't dissolve non-polar molecules such as oils. If you ever put oil in water, you would notice that the oil just is clearly separate away from the water. It doesn't dissolve the oil. Hydrophilic means that the substance mixes or dissolves in water. It's also called a substance that loves water. Meanwhile, a colloid is a stable mixture of fine particles in liquids. So it's not a solution per se, because it still has fine particles. It's not one solution. It's also called a suspension. And it's mainly when large amounts of hydrophilic substances are dissolved in water, some still get left behind. And an example is your blood, because your blood, it's not completely dissolved. You still have like tiny cells and other substances, particles in your blood. It's a suspension. Hydrophobic repels water or fears water. Molarity is the moles of solute per liter of solution. So what is a mole? Bit of background again, molecular mass is the sum of all masses in a molecule. So you just take the individual masses of each atom, add it together, and you find the molecular mass. A mole is a unit of measure, and it's basically 6.02 times 10 to the power of 23 moles in 1 gram. That's a large number. A mole of a substance has the same number of molecules as a mole of another substance. That might seem extremely complicated, but it's basically saying that if I had sum of substance A here and sum of substance B here, this would have the same number of moles, but even if it had different molecular masses. That would be explained more in my chemistry videos, which if you're watching in the far future, it's already uploaded, but if not, then I'll upload it soon. So now acids and bases, I can get rid of my amazing water molecules there. Hydrogen ion, it's basically H plus. It's also called a proton. And as we talked about, hydrogen has one electron and one proton, no neutron. So its nucleus is just one proton. And hydrogen ion basically gets rid of that electron. So what is it? It's just a proton. So it's written as H plus. Hydroxide ion is OH minus. So it's basically O, H, H, right? It's H2O, but one of these hydrogens, so this one still has its proton and its electron, but this one, it lost its proton, which means there's one extra electron here, and that's why it's a minus right there. There's an extra electron, so it's OH minus. There's hydrogen and oxygen and an extra electron. So basically, water splits into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion. You can also say it splits into a hydroxide ion and a hydronium ion, which is H3O plus. It's an H2O that gained a proton. For example, if we had two H2O molecules right here, maybe I should have kept my drawings. Then this proton goes here. This one becomes OH minus because it lost a proton. And this one becomes H3O plus. It gained a proton. You can simplify this into H plus because as we'll talk about, water or H2O is basically just neutral. It doesn't really matter in acids and bases. So if you get rid of the H2O here, you just get H plus. An acid donates H plus in aqueous solution. And when you dissolve it in water, it increases the H plus concentration. A strong acid dissolves completely. A weak acid is reversible, so it can accept back H plus. Strong acids can't because it dissolves completely. A base accepts H plus. It can also donate hydroxide ions. This reduces the H plus concentrations because even if it doesn't accept H plus ions exactly, it donates hydroxide, and hydroxide's first tendency is to bond with the hydrogen ion to form water. Therefore, it gets rid of this hydrogen ion that was already in the water. Strong base again dissolves completely, weak base reversible. It can donate back an H plus. Important concept, the product of the hydrogen ions and the hydroxide ion concentrations are always 10 to the power of negative 14. So for example, if this was given to be, 10 to the power of negative 9, then we would know this would be 10 to the power of negative 5. Given one, we can always find the other. A neutral solution has the concentration the same and 10 to the power of negative 7. And a neutral solution is basically water. pH is the negative base 10 logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration. It's basically, if you see the concentration, it's 10 to the power of negative 7. You take the exponent and you negate it. So first it was negative 7 and then you negate it, so it's 7. Therefore, the pH of a neutral solution is 7. So the pH scale is the range of pH, and it's a useful way to show concentrations because because the number or the pH would depend on whether it's an acid or a base. So 7 is neutral, like we said. 10 to the power of -7 means it has a pH of 7. Neutral is also called water. But if it's less than 7, it's an acid. A strong acid is closer to 0, while a weak acid is closer to 7. A base has a pH more than 7. Strong acid closer to, strong base closer to 14. Weak base closer to 7. A buffer is a substance that minimizes change in pH. So it's really important in our bodies because let's say we drink a lot of lemonade. So there's so much acid in our stomach because lemonade is extremely acidic. We need buffers to minimize the change in pH. Otherwise, since it's a strong acid, it'll go down. Our pH would go down to, 6. But our blood and our body needs to be at a constant pH. Like I said, necessary in blood. Ocean acidification is an application of acids and bases. It's when excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in oceans and forms carbonic acid. It basically just becomes an aqueous solution in the entire ocean, and it's really harmful to the environment. Acid precipitation is precipitation or rain with pH less than 5.2. So the main cause is burning of fossil fuels, and this includes sulfur rain, acid rain. You've probably heard of those things. And now carbon. Carbon is literally the reason we're alive, other than water. Carbon is so important. There's a branch of chemistry, organic chemistry, dedicated specifically to carbon and its compounds. Why is it important? Well, carbon has 4 valence electrons, which means it can covalently bond with a large number of elements, and it can form many possible bonds. CO2, for example, it looks like this. So it can form a bond with oxygen, it can form a bond with hydrogen, it can form a bond with nitrogen, it can form a bond with a lot of elements. And that's because it has 4 valence electrons. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because methane, for example, it needs 4 more electrons, right? So methane is CH4. Each hydrogen shares an electron. So it can literally bond with 4 hydrogens. Or we can get rid of this hydrogen and bond some sort of oxygen, which then bonds to another oxygen and then a hydrogen somewhere over there. And look at this. This is a huge molecule, and that's small compared to other molecules we'll see. Carbon can form huge compounds. That's why our next video would be on macromolecules, molecules that are large, made up of carbon, etc. It can also form many possible bonds. So instead of all this, it could form a double bond with oxygen. And of course, we'd have to get rid of another hydrogen for that, but still, it's worth it. Now, this oxygen can bond with another oxygen, and so on. The most common elements that bond with carbon, like I mentioned, are hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Carbon skeletons or molecules are basically molecules that made up of carbon that have a large variety. And the reason there's so many and so much variety is these reasons. Length. So it can be any length. It can be as small as methane, or it can be as large as thousands of carbons. Branching, meaning you could have this molecule. It's going to take a long time for me to write down the exact form. You know what? to write down exact formulas like C over here, H over here, etc. So let's just say this was a molecule. You could also have that same molecule, but with a hydrogen over here. Of course, you'll have to get rid of one of these over here. And you can also make it with two hydrogens. We'll have to get rid of one of these atoms over here, but still, branching makes it possible to do a large number of molecules. Double bond position, you can have a double bond anywhere, as long as it's with an oxygen or a nitrogen, or you can't have a double bond with hydrogen though. In the presence of rings, rings are nice shapes. And for example, carbohydrates, we'll talk about them in the next lesson. A lot of them are forced into ring shapes, especially glucose. A hydrocarbon is a molecule consisting of only hydrogen and carbon. For example, methane is a hydrocarbon because it's CH4, only hydrogen and carbon. Hydrocarbons can undergo reactions that release relatively large amounts of energy. That's why they're so important, and that's why when you burn methane, you get a lot of energy, but it's harmful to the environment as well. An isomer is a molecule that has the same number of elements, but different properties. Well, same number of same elements. So for example, C2, or sorry, a very famous one, C6H12O6 and C6H12O6. What's the difference? Well, you're gonna find out. This one's glucose, this one's fructose. They both have the same chemical formula, but their structure is very different. Structural isosomes like glucose and fructose differ in the covalent arrangement of skeletons. So one of them looks, this is a ring of glucose. This one is how glucose looks, and this one is how fructose looks. Looks almost the same, except it has a different position of covalent arrangements. It's basically flipped. And a few other, its atoms are mixed up. Cis-trans isomers have same covalent bonds, but different spatial arrangements. A cis isomer, the X's are on the same side, and the trans isomer, the X's are on opposite sides. So when we say X's, I basically mean groups. So it can start with a C and it has some element, maybe H over here and H over here. If it has an X over here, which is basically a group, like it can extend forever basically, but X is just a molecule basically. And an X over here, this is trans because the X's are on opposite sides. But if we had something like this, H over here, H over here, X over here, and X over here, then this would be a cis isomer. And these would be isomers. They have the same number of same elements, but it's cis trans because they differ in spatial arrangements. And finally, enantiomers are mirror images. So, but they still have different properties. It's not, they have the same covalent bonds, they have the same elements, they have the same number of atoms. They're literally mirror images of each other, but they have very different properties. This is a bit more rare than the others. An asymmetric carbon is a carbon bonded to 4 atoms. Like for example, methane has an asymmetric carbon. Basically, all of the bonds to it are single bonds. It needs 4 electrons, so it shares 4 electrons with 4 different atoms. In enantiomers, only one is biologically active, usually. The other is usually basically nothing. It doesn't really work well. The other one is usually some sort of drug or something that's some medicine maybe. ATP is an important molecule. It's an organic molecule that releases most of energy needed for cells. It reacts with H2O in a process called hydrolysis and releases energy. This is basically the currency of cells. So functional groups of carbon are basically groups that can be attached to a molecule and it'll be part of that functional group. So some important ones, hydroxyl, OH, it's polar and it can form hydrogen bonds with H2O. Carbonyl, CO, some are found in sugars. These are called ketoses and aldoses. Ketones, the carbonyl is in the skeleton, in the middle of the skeleton. And the aldehydes, the carbonyl is at the end of the skeleton. So for example, if we had some sort of molecule here, and the carbonyl is here, I'm just gonna write that there. This would be an aldehyde. But if we had something like this, and the CO, the carbonyl was here, this would be a ketone. Carboxyl is COOH. It acts as an acid, and its ionized form is found in many cells. It's really important. Similarly, amino, NH2, it acts as a base, and its ionized form is found in cells. You'll hear amino a lot, especially when we talk about macromolecules, because amino acids make up proteins, which are one of the important macromolecules we're talking about. Sulfhydryl SH, two sulfhydryl groups can covalently bond and help stabilize protein structure. So extremely important to proteins. Phosphate, remember when we talked about ATP on the previous slide? It's a phosphate molecule. It contributes negative charge and has the potential to release energy when it reacts with water. That's what we talked about. Methyl, CH3, affects the expressions of genes, so also an important functional group. Those are water and carbon, the most important molecules of life. Next, we'll talk about some more molecules that are important, a bit more chemistry, macromolecules. These are molecules that are made up of carbon and are relatively large. So that's it for today's lesson. See you guys next week. Bye.